Hey guys, I recently posted a picture to Instagram of my latest pedalboard setup, and I'm super excited about this because I've never had a board so neatly organized. And um, I'm not a huge fan of multi-effects rack units and pedal boards. I've tried them all, but you know, I don't get my inspiration from those necessarily. They're a little bit overwhelming. Totally cool to use in a studio, but for me, to encourage my creative process, I really need to have like individual control over every little thing and not be overwhelmed by too many options. Also, it's a lot more fun to put together to customize your own thing as opposed to being given everything under the sun. For me, that's my preference. So this board was built using entirely Temple Audio parts. So the board is Temple Audio. The power supply is, I guess they partnered up with Chalk's power supplies. And I have two patch bays on the side so I can run a guitar. Instead of going into a pedal, I run it into a patch bay. And I have a couple other ones that go uh, to the amp effects loop, one that's controlling the foot switch on the amp. So yeah, let me show you what I have here. So here we have it. Um, the ES8 here in the center is pretty much the only pedal I intend on actually using. And this is not a multi-effects pedal. This is a loop switcher. So the way this works is all the pedals are on all the time, and you program which loops you want to activate. So my JHS Morning Glory is running into a single loop. My Sparkle Drive is running into a single loop, and so forth. And I program these foot switches to activate which loops I want to run at a given time. So, for example, my first preset there is only the Morning Glory. The loop that's activated is only the Morning Glory. The second one is the first two loops are activated, so I get a little bit more drive. And then further down the line, I think preset 5 is I have everything off except for the Tube Screamer. So the Tube Screamer is activated, and there's a foot switch out to my amp here, my Friedman, that flips it to the dirty channel. So that's like my standard rhythm, modern metal tone. So I'm sure all of you have seen these pedals a zillion times, so there's nothing really unique about the pedals. But let me get a little bit closer and show you from end to end how this is all wired. So it all starts here with the input from the guitar. This is then sent over to the input of the NS2. That is then sent to the ES8, so that's this input here. And then from there, all of these are just individual loops. So you have, let me get that in focus. This is the first loop going to my Morning Glory. This second loop is Sparkle Drive, and so on. So these are all individual loops. And these cables are some Boss Pedalboard cable kit. I'll put a link to that somewhere. What's cool about this Boss ES8 though is that down the line here, there's a send volume loop, which is pretty much an always-on loop. if you actually have it on. I mean, you can, via the settings here, you can decide whether you want it on or off, but once it's on, it's always on. It doesn't work like one of these other loops here. So this is, all of my drives are happening before this send volume loop. That send volume loop is then going out to the input of my amp. So all of this is just gain staging. So everything up until this point has just been cleaning up the signal, some overdrives depending on what I'm looking for, out to the input of my amp. So now I've got my tone fully built. I've got my overdrives and my amp tone. Then the effect send comes from the back of my amp back in here into the next patch bay, which then gets sent to the return of my effects loop. So I'm cleaning it up for the second time. I was cleaning it up from the input from my guitar. Maybe I was using some single coils, and then I'm cleaning it up coming from my amp, and the amp is going to obviously add some buzz as well. Because at this point, all my tone is preamp, is overdrives and my preamp. From there, I run into the underneath all of this is oh, actually this one is just going right here. So the final output from this NS2 is going to my volume pedal. Volume pedal goes to the freeze. And I like that configuration because I can freeze something at a certain level. Say I, froze a chord at, a full volume, or maybe 50% volume. I can then adjust this depending on how present I want to be over that. So I can like kind of solo quietly in the background, or I can solo nice and loud, but it won't affect the volume that was the chord, volume that was frozen. So that's the end of that volume loop. That goes back in. So into the send loop. And then I actually put both of these on the same. I put both of those within the same effects loop. So I think it's probably this one, possibly send 5. Yeah, send 6. I didn't mention, but my POG is also in before the send volume loop. So my POG is before the tone hits my amp head. And the very last thing is, after all the gain staging and tone shaping, is the time-based stuff. So this is coming after that whole send volume loop that I just walked through. And those are pretty much on all the time. I either, if I'm using like a rhythm tone, they'll be turned off. But if I'm using like a clean thing or a lead sound or some kind of tone where I'm playing a melody, those are pretty much always going to be on just the way that they are. And what's kind of cool about this pedal in particular is that if, I don't typically go crazy with different kinds of reverbs and delays. I definitely don't go crazy with different kinds of delays. But, if I wanted something with a little bit more soaked reverb, I could save that as a favorite. And I can just have my standard reverb that I use just about across the board. And then I can have this one set to some drenched reverb for some certain sections. And it's not difficult for me to just reach over and hit that one on occasion. So then the Boss ES8 is done at that point, and we go out through this final patch bay, and this is into the effect loop return on my amp, and that is pretty much the end of it. There's one more patch bay here that is going to the foot switch on my amp, and that is being controlled by this one. So the other cool thing about these external controls on this ES8 is that I'm using these two to control. This first one is controlling this switch here. So that's this. That first external control is flipping the low or high gain on this pedal. And this one is controlling the channel on my amp. So, in a single foot switch, I can activate which loops I want, and in any configuration. The fact that these are in this order doesn't actually matter with this thing. I can switch them up from preset to preset. And also I can control what this thing is doing as well. So when I say preset 5, I could pretty much reorganize, turn on, turn off, whatever I want. And also flip that guy. And it's all kind of nice and neatly organized here. The reason I have 4 overdrive pedals is because I like to stack them to increase the saturation, as opposed to getting a pedal where I could, say, use MIDI to turn up the gain. I like how this sounds. I've tried it the other way, but for me, this is the way I like to do it. So, I'll have a preset with only the Morning Glory on, which is a transparent overdrive. It doesn't really add any of its own flavor to it. It just kind of boosts my signal unlike a tube screamer that adds its own flair. You know, the Morning Glory does not. So I like to have that one almost all the time, even for clean stuff. I have that one on, just giving it a little bit more punch. Then, when I want to play something slightly more distorted, I turn on the sparkle drive, and I have everything on that pedal right now, pretty much at noon, which is like give me 50% of your saturation, give me 50%, you know, tone smack in the middle. There's also a cool on the sparkle drive. There's a knob for clean, which is how much of the signal before the pedal you want to come through versus post processing. So in the center, what I'm actually doing is I'm sending to the rest of the chain two sounds. I'm sending my my Morning Glory only sound and my Morning Glory plus Sparkle Drive sound at the same time. It doesn't really come off like two tones. It blends it really nicely. You know, I really like that pedal. It's a lot of fun. So that would be like, you know, Stratocaster neck pickup, just a little bit more on the crunchy side, but not clean kind of tone. Then when I'm doing that, like, you know, modern Holdsworthy type stuff, I use a tube screamer. I'm layering that on top of both the Morning Glory and the Sparkle Drive. So that's really giving a little bit more drive, a little more saturation, and kind of rounding out the sound. And I actually bring the tone knob all the way down on that. And I get like a really nice, smooth, round, saturated lead tone. I then go one step further and using the external control in the ES8, run that to the red input on the Morning Glory, which flips the gain on the Morning Glory. So when I want the most saturated sound, I layer on all four of those things. So Morning Glory now flips to the high gain setting, the Sparkle Drive, and then the Tube Screamer. So that's kind of how I like to stack my overdrives based on, you know, the type of sound I'm going for, the type of guitar I'm playing, the type of section it might be in. Then I have a second tube screamer because I really like to use the tube screamer for two different scenarios. One is for that modern smooth lead tone, and the second is for the modern metal rhythm tone where you have your overdrive almost entirely off or even off and the level cranked. So these two are, I believe they're essentially the same pedal. The Mini is a replicate, is pretty much a TS808. Yeah, I'm kind of looking at an article now. So I'm pretty sure they're the same pedal, but I tune them up a little bit differently based on what I'm doing. So my second tube screamer is actually used to crank the level, drop the overdrive, and run that into the distortion channel of my amp. The Pog pedal, there's not a whole lot to say about that. I haven't even really used it a whole lot yet. You know, octave stuff. You could pull back the attack on your notes to get like more of a synth sound, but I don't have a whole lot to say about that right now. And as I mentioned, the delay and my reverb are, whenever I turn on those effects, I usually turn them on at the same time, you know, so I run those through the same loop in the ES8. Then, yeah, just, I guess the last thing I want to say is just the Boss NS2. I have a feeling someone's going to ask me why don't I use the decimator G string, and I probably would if I had one. I just don't right now. I've had this pedal for years, so you know I'm using it. And the kind of the four jacks on this pedal are really important if you're running this, if you're using the effects loop on your amp, because it allows you to send your signal to it twice. So you run your guitar into it the first time and it cleans up your signal straight from your guitar. Nothing comes before that. You run right into the NS2 first. Then you have all your overdrives and stuff. Not your time-based effects, your overdrives, your amp, your preamp, whatever. Then when you've got your tone, you run back into it again, and that cleans up any hum that may have been added from all of the distortion, gain, saturation stuff that you've added. So that really is I've set that up exactly how I want it. And then the time-based effects are last because you don't want a gate after your time-based effects, you know, killing any sort of like delay trail or reverb. You want those to flatten out on their own naturally. So there you have it. That's my pedal board for now until I get bored with it and make a new one. But I have a feeling this one is going to stick around for a little bit.